Greetings, beauties, beloveds around planet Earth. So many of you know that I was doing a live stream series of different UFO and ET experiences and encounters various people have had throughout the years. And I was sharing my favorite ones on YouTube, particularly in the live stream. And I wanted to revisit the encounter because it was so popular and so many people loved it, about Albert Coe, the encounter this young gentleman of 16 years old had on the Mattawa River in 1920. And it's not such a common experience that people have heard about, but it is one of my favorites because what actually happened was extraordinary. And I shared the first part of this encounter on this video. So sit back and listen to Albert Coe talking about his initial encounter that he had with a being, a man from the planet Venus.
The story's initial setting is found in the eternal beauty of nature, in her forests and mountains, the blue skies above, and on the tumbling streams that cut through a primal wilderness. It is June of 1920, and two teenagers on vacation from school had shipped their canoe and equipment to Canada, and from there to follow the downriver currents back home to Hastings-on-Hudson. We picked up the canoe in lengthening shadows as it silently glides over the surface of Trout Lake and introduced its two paddlers, my pal Rod and myself. We were heading for a shoreline banked with tall pines, silhouetted in black against the brilliant hues of a setting sun. Here we pitched tent, and after preparing supper, sat down to eat in the warming glow of our campfire. The next morning, I never dreamed that an incident, not even remotely connected to the theme of this venture, was to take place, and that it would definitely influence all my thought trends, in fact, to mold part of my life in all the years that were to follow. For the next 3 days, we made our leisurely way downstream, camping, fishing, exploring, the excitement of shooting the rapids and carrying our canoe around a couple of jams caused by uprooted trees, logs, and debris. At one jam, we had to hoist our canoe over a rocky escarpment with ropes to get to clear water on the other side. At the third one of these barriers, the river branched into several small streams, ponds, and swamp. Being late afternoon, we decided to camp for the night and await morning to find an easy way through and locate the main channel of the river at the other end. We were up at the crack of dawn, caught and cooked 2 pickerel. After breakfast, we watered down the fire and started out on foot to find an accessible passage through or around this tangled morass. My pal took the right side, I went left, and had traveled about a half mile over extremely rough terrain that posed an impossible portage. My curiosity getting the better of me as to what lay ahead kept me going, and as I was clambering up the side of an outcropping of rocks near the top, I heard a muffled cry for help. I looked around, but could see no one, for it was thickly overgrown with small trees and bushes, so I climbed up over the edge and let out a yell. Slightly to the right and ahead of me came an answer. "Oh, help! Help me! Down here!" I still couldn't see anyone, and had walked about 25 feet in the direction of the voice when I came to a 5-foot wide cleft in the base rock that ran diagonally toward the river. Wedged down in this narrowing crevice was a young man with his head some 2.5 feet from the surface. He only had one arm free, so I reached over and grabbed his wrist, but could not budge him. I cut down a tall sapling to use as a lever, and working my rope under the pit of his pinned arm, circled it around his back and chest, bringing a loop to ground level, at the same time telling him I would try to pry him out. If I failed, I told him not to worry, for my pal was somewhere on the other side of the river, and between the two of us we would free him. Slipping the pole through the loop and using the opposite edge as a fulcrum point, I gave a heave and felt him move. Raising the lever higher, I propped it on a tree branch, jumped the crevice, and pulled him out. His legs were so numb that he could not stand, and the left hip, knee, and shin were badly lacerated. He first asked for water, so I scrambled down the rocks to the river, and utilizing my old felt hat as a bucket, relieved his thirst. Slitting a couple of my bandanas, I bathed the wounds and bound up his knee, shin, and ankle, for they had started to bleed again. Under a rip in his suit, I placed a cold damp cloth for a pack on his hip, helping him. My curiosity was rising as to the identity of my patient. I told him of our trip and that I had been searching for a way to open water, at the same time noticing he was wearing an odd silver grey, tight jumper type garment that had a sheen of silk to it. It had a leathery feeling without a belt or visible fasteners attached, but just under the chest was a small instrument panel. Several of the knobs and dials were broken from being jammed against the rock in his fall. Being so many miles from any form of civilization, I pointedly asked where he was from, if he was on a canoe trip, also when and what had happened to cause his misfortune. He said that he was not canoeing, but had a plane parked in a clearing 300 or 400 yards downstream, and had started out early the previous morning to do some fishing. In attempting to jump over the crevice, the loose earth and moss had given way underfoot, and he had just about given up all thought of ever getting out alive when he heard some of the stones loosened in my ascent bouncing down the rock. Although not certain whether it was a man, animal, or just a small slide, he decided to cry out and said that my answering yell was like a miracle, for even though he had hoped, did not actually expect to hear a human voice in this deep wilderness. He asked for my name and address and told me that he also lived in the United States and would surely write, as he would be eternally grateful for giving him back his life. He was carrying a small tackle box and a fishing rod when he fell and asked if I could look for them. I searched and couldn't locate the tackle box. It had probably fallen into the crevice, but I did find the fishing rod under some brambles, and the mystery of this strange person deepened within me. The peculiar outfit, a plane landing in this rocky forest, and now a fishing rod, the likes of which I had never seen. The butt was about 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and had the same leathery touch as his suit, but bright blue and formed a slight rounded protuberance just above it. It had a tiny slot on either side, and continuance in a slender aluminium-like shaft. It had no guides or reel, for the line came directly out from the inside at its tip, as a fine filament to which was attached a conventional dry fly. I asked where had he purchased such a rod, and the question was partially parried with a reply that his father was a research engineer, and it was one of his own design. The circulation had returned to his numbed limbs, and although I noticed a few grimaces of pain, tended to ignore it. His overall composure was extraordinarily calm, without apparent reaction to stress or shock, which usually would be evident after such a long and torturous ordeal. But I did suggest a helping hand back to his plane. The offer was declined. He said, by his observation from the air, that my pal and I had 5 to 6 tough miles ahead of us. The opposite side, to him, looked lower, far less rocky, and thought perhaps we could pull the canoe through some of the shallow, swampy water, dragging it over many of the lesser obstacles. He did not want to impose on me any further, and said I had better think of starting back, for he had already been quite a burden. From the condition of his leg, I doubted that he could even walk, but made no comment as I helped him up. He took 2 steps, swayed, and grabbed a tree to keep from going down. I threw one arm around his waist, lifted his left arm over my shoulder, and insisted that he again accept my aid, if for no other reason than just plain human compassion. I just couldn't let him go off alone, for if he fell and broke his neck, my time surely would have been wasted. He finally gave in, but on the condition of a promise, asking for my solemn word that I would not divulge to anyone, not even my partner, anything that had taken place today, or what I may see. He then told me that his father had developed a new type of plane that was still in an experimental stage and highly secret, but he often helped in the lab when home from school. As a sort of a test, his father had permitted him to use the plane for this fishing trip. In the future, he would fully explain the reason for his request that I keep my promise. I agreed. So after half supporting and carrying him over some of the real rough spots, we finally made our way to a small clearing, not more than 70 or 80 feet wide, and near its center stood his plane. I had been trying to figure how to get a plane in and out of here without hitting a tree or protruding rocks. What secret gimmick could launch one without a runway? I had fully expected to see some type of conventional aircraft, and the reason for the reluctance in my accompanying him became crystal clear. For what I was looking at astounded me. A round silver disc, about 20 feet in diameter, was standing on 3 legs in the form of a tripod, without propeller, engine, wings, or fuselage. As we approached, I noticed a number of small slots around the rim, and it sloped up to a rounded central dome. I had to duck to walk with him underneath, between the legs, although it was slightly concave and only about 4.5 feet from the ground. He said, "Surprised?" That wasn't actually the word for it, but I did not press him with questions, realizing he was suffering a great deal of pain. He reached into the end of one of the 3 recessed in its bottom that fans center-wise from the base of each leg, pressed a button, and a door swung down with 2 ladder rungs molded on its inner surface. I clasped my hands under his good foot and boosted him in. He peered down at me over the rim of the opening and said, "I will never forget you for this day. Remember to keep your promise and stand clear when I take off." I retraced my steps to just within the trees at the side of the clearing and turned to watch. I was musing over its lack of windows or portholes and wondered how he could see out unless they were on the other side. Just then, the perimeter edge began to revolve. At first it gave off a low whirling sound, picked up speed, mounting to a high-pitched whine, finally going above the audible capabilities of the ear. At that time, I had experienced a throbbing sensation, which was felt rather than heard. It seemed to compress me within myself. As it lifted a few feet above the ground, it paused with a slight fluttering, the legs folded into the recesses as it swiftly rose with the effortless ease of thistledown, caught in an updraft of air, and was gone.
So, as Albert was saying, he met this man stuck in this crevice, in this ravine. He had been there overnight and obviously was very close to death. Actually, Albert was not aware of how close he was to death, and it wasn't until encounters thereafter that Albert became aware of how close Zret, as we will come to learn, was close to death. And had it not been for Albert's rescue and help, he would have perished in that crevice that he was stuck in. And as you'll come to learn, Zret is from the planet Venus. As our scientists say, that Venus is covered by a heavy atmosphere of cloud. And actually, this has been confirmed by extraterrestrials, saying that Venus is covered with a thick atmosphere, but underneath this atmosphere is incredible life, incredible environment, and beautiful biodiversity. So it's interesting to note this, and Zret says that they have come to Earth for a long time to visit and observe man's progression on this planet.
I started toward camp, a little bewildered, for it all seemed like pantomime of unrealities. It was an episode lasting not much more than an hour that may have carried me 1,000 years into the future, and yet left an uneasy feeling of witnessing something that did not actually exist. An impression of disconnected sequences only found in dreams. A mere youth entrusted with such a wonderful invention, the peculiar suit, the odd fishing rod, the jagged rock of the crevice, and began to wonder if it were not I who had fallen, knocked myself out, and was suffering the distortion of a stunned brain. I ran back to hunt for the tackle box without success, but part of a blood-stained bandana, the lever pole, its stump and branches were still there. I arrived in camp first, kindled a small fire, and put the leftover coffee on the heat, but my thoughts were dogged by the strange sequel of events that my mind kept reliving, step by step. Although I could not fasten onto a logical explanation that I had seen and touched a solid metal object, without even the rudimentary elements that have always been associated with flight, whether natural or invented by man. Even a balloon had to be filled with gas before it could go up. I had also watched this object whisk away like a flying carpet under a sorcerer's magic spell. The coffee pot boiled over, snapping me out of my thought trance, and I was pouring a cup when Rod returned with information that he had traveled a couple of miles, more than half of it being low, marshy, and a lot of debris partially submerged. He figured by attaching our ropes to the bow ring, we could drag the canoe through most of it, even though I could hear Rod's voice explaining. My thoughts wandered back to my newly acquired, strange friend, what he had said about the surrounding area. It coincided with what Rod was now telling me. I knew then that all I had ever experienced was very real, and made a silent vow never to break my promise.
So, as we'll come to learn throughout this series, Zret, even though they and his civilization live on Venus, they originate from a planet called Norca, which is surrounding Tau Ceti. And what actually happened was Norca was in peril as a planet, and they needed to leave. They needed to evacuate their planet, and they found Venus and settled on Venus. So I hope you enjoyed this small little series of part 1 of Albert Coe and his encounter with Dread, the Venusian, the man from Venus. I mean, it's extraordinary to think that we are surrounded by life, and yet our world is not acknowledging that we are. But amongst ourselves, we can share and exchange these stories and talk about them and acknowledge them and be a part of that galactic environment, even though our leaders and our world in general is not acknowledging that. Doesn't stop us from acknowledging that. So I hope you enjoyed the first part, and in the next video I hope to bring you more of this story. Albert Coe and his encounter. His book, The Shocking Truth, is incredible. 1920. And so until next time, I send you my blessings, and may you always be blessed by the supreme truth and love of the cosmos, as always.